Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Devar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Kilayim, Chapter 2, Halacha 6. This is part 2 of the shiur, and in the art scroll we're on 19a2. Today we are getting into visual dividers for fields of land. For instance, what happens if you have a road? What happens if you have a drainage ditch? What happens if you have a very, very large rock dividing this field and that field? What happens if you have a fence dividing this field and that field? And with a lot of the shiur coming up, what happens if you have a very visible dry patch of land next to some irrigated land? Well, is that going to make a visual distinction to separate this field from that field? In fact, all of these things are going to separate field 1 from field 2. We learn about this in Masechet Peah because over there we need to know how many sets of Peah we're going to leave if we plant everything. So if you have a drainage ditch and it's going to be 4 tefachim wide and 10 tefachim deep, and you're going to have a planting over here of wheat and a planting over here of wheat, it's going to be where you're going to leave 2 sets of Peah. You can't combine it together because that is a visually distinctive thing that separates this field from that field. Now, it's going to also apply for Kilayim because it's going to be where if you're planting in this visually distinctive area, you'll be able to see that this field is not connected to that field. Now, keep in mind, in Vayikra 19:19, this is going to be the source of the idea. The idea over there is not to sew the fields together. You can't have intermingling. And how do you prevent intermingling? Well, you need these separations. And if you have these separations, even if it can be very close by, it's going to be visually distinct. So the first issue that we're going to get into today is about if you have a patch of dry land next to irrigated land. So the Gemara is going to introduce this permit to plant diverse species in a single field without separating them. Now we know that that would be a problem. You need a separator. But in this case, the visual distinctiveness of the land itself is going to be the separator. So the Gemara starts off and it says, concerning a patch of dry land in the middle of someone's field, one is permitted to sow it with any species of vegetable he desires, even if the rest of the field is planted with another crop entirely. Why? Because the dry patch is going to be noticeably different in appearance than the irrigated portion of the field. And when you go by and you look at it, it's going to be viewed like a separate and distinct area, and therefore the crops are not going to be Kilayim with those of the field next to it. Now, the subtlety that's going to be coming up here is that you have to leave part of this dry land over. You can't fully plant it. If you fully plant the dry land so all of it's used, then a guy walking by is going to look at it. He's not going to be able to tell that any part of it was dry land. It's all going to be assumed to be irrigated. But if you're separating out an area and leaving it as dry so that everybody can walk by and see this arid area, then you'll be able to do it. Now, the Gemara is going to qualify this and how to use this dry patch. Rabbi Yochanan says that the permit only applies if one plants 3 out of 6 tefachim of a dry row. In other words, if you have 6 tefachim, if you have less than 6 tefachim, that's going to be an issue. By the way, it's going to come up. They're going to give many, many cases about this. And what happens if you have less than 4 tefachim and then you have a 2 tefachim strip over there? Is it going to combine? We'll get into that. But you need, let's say, 6 tefachim. That's going to be the magic number. And half of it has to be planted. Half of it has to be left to be a visual distinctive indicator that this is a dry area. So the idea is that, as Rabbi Yochanan says, is that this permit is applying only if the plants have 3 out of the 6 tefachim as the dry row. And that's meaning that the row has to measure at least 6 tefachim across. And 3 of those 6 tefachim have to be left alone. And that way, everybody walks by and they can see that this is a separating strip and that this is not all done in a single planting, that this dry land is really going to be something different. It's going to be considered a separate area. and that therefore the crop is not going to be considered Kilayim. So the Rabbi Yochanan is basically explaining, according to Rabbi Kanievsky's Beur shiurim, that if you have at least 3 of the 6 tefachim, that the 3 tefachim have to be planted. Otherwise, the dry area is going to be deemed insignificant and is not going to constitute a separate and distinct area. And Rabbi Kanievsky explains about this that if both of these criteria are met, then the vegetables planted in the dry area are not going to be Kilayim with the different species in the neighboring fields. Again, people are going to walk by and they're going to look at this and they're going to see that it's visually distinctive. So Rabbi Yochanan continues and says, and 3 tefachim of land next to a fence are treated as dry land, since this area is going to be typically hard and dry. And accordingly, if you have a 3 tefach strip alongside a fence, it can combine with a 3 tefach strip of dry land next to it to form this 6 tefach row where you can have a foreign species of vegetable that can be planted. So the idea here, says the Rosh Hashanah, is that people don't normally irrigate the area alongside a wall or a fence, and they don't want the water to go in and weaken the wall's foundation or the fence or to rot a wooden fence. So you kind of keep the water away from it, and you end up with these dry patches naturally along these fences. The question is, can you go ahead and plant next to it? So if you're having a fence that you're not watering next to it because you don't want to rot your fence, and you have irrigated land, and you have a 6 tefach strip, and for whatever reason you decide that you're going to plant a 3 tefach strip that's next to the fence, and you're going to leave this 3 tefach strip of dry land there, you have a total of 2 strips, and it combines to this 6 tefach area measure that we're talking about. That's going to be just fine. Now, normally when somebody thinks about a fence, they think, oh, well, I need this on that side of the fence, and I need the other species on the other side of the fence, and the fence is going to make a separator. But the nuance here is this is saying that you're going to have a fence, and here's how you can do it, where you have 2 species on the same side of the fence. But again, people are going to walk by, and they're going to see this dry strip of land, and they're going to know that this is really going to be a separate area. It's going to be deemed as significant enough with the 3 tefach strip of dry land plus the 3 tefach row that's over there away from the irrigated land to show that this is not going to be Kilayim and it's going to have enough significance. Now, the Gemara is going to look at the next of these sets of cases. These are all going to be conditions of what does this mean, right? So here's a pair of scenarios in where you can have a foreign species that's going to be planted on a dry patch, and it can be extended into the irrigated land. So that's how we're going to do it. Now, the last case about the fence, you have the vegetables that are being planted right next to the fence, you have the dry strip separating the vegetables next to the fence, and then you have the irrigated land that has something else. So you have this visual distinctiveness. But the next case is going to be a little bit different because, again, we're playing around with this 6 tefachim area where you have to leave 3 tefach alone. So the next case is going to be where you have this 6 tefach strip, and you're going to have one area where you're going to have a 6 tefach area of dry land. Then that's going to be left unplanted, of course. And then you have a 3 tefach strip with your vegetables that you're trying to plant. Let's say they're going to be carrots. Then you have so that's 6 tefachim, right? It's 3 tefach plus 3 tefach. Now, you're going to have something a little bit different. You're going to have the irrigated land that's next to it. And what is going next to it? You're going to have a 1 tefach strip of species 1 that is going to be on the dry land that's planted, let's say your carrots. And then in the irrigated area, you're going to have species 2. Let's say you have cabbage. Now, in this case, all 4 tefachim of the species 1 being the carrots in this case, this is all going to be exempt from Kilayim. Why? Because you have this 6 tefach area of dry land. And they're playing around with trying to talk about this concept where you have, these rows, and the Gemara is ruling that, and I'll read it in a second, that all 4 tefachim are going to be granted this same dispensation. And just like you have foreign plants growing in the dry area, they're not going to be Kilayim, so too plants growing in the adjoining tefach, since they're going to be planted at the same time, they're going to be deemed to be a single entity, and they're all going to be permitted. That's going to be the idea by Rabbi Kanievsky to explain this. So the idea is that if you're planting all of this together, okay, you're going to plant your cabbages and you're going to plant your carrots together. You have your dry land over here. It's 3 tefachim. That's a 3 tefach strip. It's unplanted. And then you have your 3 tefach strip. That's going to be with your carrots. That's going to be species 1. You're planting it all at the same time. There's a 1 tefach strip of carrots in the irrigated portion of the land. We have no problem with this 6 tefach dry land area. And what this is trying to teach is that you don't necessarily need the 3 tefach strip of unplanted land to be separating between the vegetables in species 1, in this case the carrots, and then what you have in species 2 in the irrigated land, in that case going to be cabbage. This is talking about a way that you can do it together. And what this is trying to show is that if you're planting it all together at the same time, it's not going to be considered to be Kilayim, even though you have the plants adjoining next to each other. But again, you're going to have this visual distinctiveness of the dry strip there. And that's going to be something where somebody's going to walk by, they're going to see that, they're going to know what's going on. And they're also, if you didn't have this dry strip and you were just planting it like this would be a Kilayim problem because there's no separator. But in this case, the separator is on the outside of the field, and you're playing along this idea of, well, you have your 6 tefachim of dry land, you've created your irrigated patch, or your planted patch of your 3 tefachim out of 6, and you're happening to put this next to the irrigated land. And the way that you're doing this is you're putting this all together, but it's going to be where it can be planted. Let me read the Gemara here, and it says that if there were 3 out of 6 tefachim of the dry row of one species, and 1 tefach of this species is sown outside of the 6 tefach dry row on the irrigated land, directly alongside the second species, this is the law. It says, since these 3 tefachim in the dry area are saved from the Kilayim designation, this tefach area of the species 1 in the irrigated area is also saved from the Kilayim designation because the entire planting is regarded as a single entity. So they're playing with this, and they're saying that, in this case, you have this 6 tefach row that's going to be situated next to the irrigated land, and because you're sowing 3 of the dry tefachim areas alongside the irrigated area, plus you have this 4th tefach within the irrigated area itself, and then you have the different species that's going to be planted on the other side of this 1 tefach strip, then basically the Gemara is going to be saying that this is not Kilayim, even though it's next to each other, because this is being planted at the same time, and you have the 6 tefachim dry area, and that's going to show where the entire thing is going to be a single entity and is going to be saved. That is going to be the halacha l'maisa too, but it's trying to show you that, look, you don't have a intermingling here, right? The idea is that you can't sow different species within the same area. What it's trying to show is they're saying, no, you have a 6 tefach area here, and you have this rule about planting 3 of the 6 tefachim. Just so happens that the 3 planted tefachim area is going to be alongside the irrigated area. What's going to be the separator? Well, it's going to be this 1 tefach strip of the same species that's going to be in the dry area, and then you get into species 2. So this is not going to be regarded as intermingling species together, and you're all saved by this dry land that's going to create this visual indicator that is different. Now you have the next case, and it's saying that if you have if there were 2 out of 6 tefachim of a dry row with one species, and 1 tefach of the species is sown just outside of the 6 tefach dry row, and there was a field of another species on the far side of the dry row, this is a law. So basically what you have is you have a 4 tefach area of unplanted land, and that's going to be your 4 out of 6 tefachim of your dry area. Then you're going to take your 2 tefach strip, and your 2 tefach strip is going to be with your species 1, let's say carrots. So that's going to add up to your 6 tefach dry area. And what's going to be next to species 1 that's planted, which is going to be your carrots? Well, you have a 1 strip row next to your carrots of species 1. And that's going to be irrigated land. So you have irrigated land on one side, you have irrigated land on the other side, you have a 6 tefach strip running between the patches of irrigated land. It's visually distinctive. And the idea is that you have this unplanted strip between species 2, and then you have 2 tefachim of species 1 that combines to make your 6 tefachim area, and then right next to your species 1, in this case carrots, you're going to have an irrigated patch, and that's going to be a 1 tefach strip, and that's going to be your carrots. One has 2 out of the 6 tefachim of the dry row sowed with the species, and the Gemara says, and 1 tefach of the species is sown just outside of the 6 tefach dry row, and there's a field of another species on the far side of the dry row. This is the law. It says, since these 2 tefachim of the dry patch are not saved from a Kilayim designation, this tefach outside of the dry patch is also not saved from a Kilayim designation. So in this case, 2 out of the 6 tefachim are sown at the edge of the dry area. Then you have a 3rd tefach in the irrigated area. What this is trying to say is that since these 3 tefachim are all sown with one species on the other side of this 4 tefachim dry row, and you have this irrigated section sowed with the vegetables of another species, so you only have the 4 tefachim strip, the idea is that the 2 tefachim that's planted in the dry area are going to be definitely Kilayim because they are less than the 6 tefachim of a foreign species, and they're going to be less than 3 out of 6. Again, Rabbi Yochanan's rule is that you have to have 3 out of 6, and this is saying that you have 2 out of 6, and this is not going to be included in the permit of the dry row. Now, you say, but wait a second, I have this 3rd tefach area in this other leftover irrigated spot that's going to be planted next to my carrots, and the 3rd tefach, however, might be permitted since it is separated by 6 tefachim from the foreign species. Nevertheless, the Gemara is ruling that because you don't have this required 6 tefach separation, this 1 tefach planting is going to be Kilayim. And the idea is, since this is planted together with the 2 tefachim of the dry area, then it's going to be regarded as a single entity. And therefore, just as the 2 are Kilayim with regarding maintaining them with watering and hoeing, so too this tefach that adjoins them is going to be problematic. So, this is going to be a case where basically this is going to be a Kilayim problem, and basically all of species 1, where you have the carrots, is going to be Kilayim with species 2. So again, because you only have 4 out of the tefachim area unplanted, again the rule is 3 out of 6. But then you say, but wait a second, but I have 4 out of 6, that should be even better. But the problem is the 1 tefach on the other area, okay? And so the problem is you don't get the leniency of the dry strip because you're planting the 1 tefach area, yes, even of carrots, next to it. And so one might think that just as, you have a tefach located in the irrigated land, it should be allowed to combine with the 3 in the dry land. But the point is that you can't use this 1 tefach strip to combine with the 2 tefach strip of dry land, it's not going to combine. That's the problem. And so this is going to be a case where, because you didn't do 3 out of 6, and yes, very good that you left a one area, that's going to be 4 out of 6. The point is that you don't get the leniency because you're required to have 3 out of 6 tefachim to be planted. Why would that be? Because it's this 2 tefachim planting strip is not significant enough. That's why. And because it's not significant enough, it's going to be regarded as Kilayim with species 2, in this case the cabbage. And yes, this bigger 4 tefachim strip is not going to be enough to save it. In other words, you have to have 3, and you can't have less than 3, because you need to have the field be significant enough to count as its own planting. That's part of what it's trying to teach you. So, very interesting that you can be ending up with a strip that's bigger than the 3 tefachim dry area, but the problem is that when you don't do the 3 tefach of planted area, your planted field is not going to be significant enough to count it as being separate from the other species that's right next to it. And so it's going to be seen as combining. That's going to be the problem. It's going to be basically Kilayim. In all of these cases, you have to have something that's going to be distinctive enough, and it has to be sizable enough. Even if it's very small, it has to be visually distinctive, and what's left over has to be distinctive enough and significant enough in that planting to make it count as being separated. That's why you get with the rosh tor something that is significant, right? A triangle that's going to be coming up next to your field. That's a visual distinctive indicator that shows that you have a significant planting of something else right next to this field. But over here, because you didn't fully do the dry portion, you only did 2 out of 6 instead of 3 out of 6, this 2 out of 6 is not significant enough, and therefore you can't do it. It's not going to be saved from the Kilayim designation. Now, the Gemara is going to look at another case on a row of dry land. And it says, if there's a row of dry land, and there's a row alongside a fence, and a row of irrigated land between the two, the dry rows close in the irrigated row on 2 sides, and therefore the 3 rows are regarded as one and can be planted with a single crop. So let's say you have your fence. Let's say you have a strip along the fence. Let's say you have the irrigated land now, and then you have the dry part. And the dry part is the furthest piece of land away from the fence. And this is saying that in this case you have the irrigated row that's going to be in the middle between the dry row and a row that's going to be alongside a fence. And that's going to be a law that's going to be like a dry row. And in other words, the dry areas that are going to be between this middle part of the dry row are going to be where on the 2 sides it's going to nullify it, so that all 3 rows are going to be viewed as a single area. Why? Because they are one area and they can be planted with only a single species. Therefore, it is generally permitted to plant a dry row on an irrigated one side by side with a different species, but in this case it's not allowed. And we have basically an interpretation of Rabbi Yochanan's ruling regarding this 3 out of 6 tefachim, and this is discussing the minimum planted area of a 6 tefach dried area. And what this new teaching is trying to show is to continue the theme, and the Chazan Ish explains about this in his Kilayim 6.2, that this Gemara is really saying that Rabbi Yochanan is concerned not with the percentage of a dry row that must be planted, but with what percentage of a dry row must be made up of the dry land. And he's ruling that a 6 tefach dry row need not be constituted entirely of dry land. Rather, any 6 tefachim area of land in which there are 3 that's going to be considered to be dry is going to, provided that there's 3 irrigated tefachim, and it's going to be sandwiched in between these strips. And when Rabbi Yochanan, according to the Chazan Ish, is saying that you have these 3 tefachim alongside a fence, it's going to be treated as dry land. And so he's referring to a 3 tefach strip of irrigated land that's bordered on one side of a fence, and on the other side, a 3 tefach strip of dry land. So he's ruling that the fence takes the place of the dry strip, and then although the irrigated strip is not bordered on two sides by the dry land, it's going to count toward the measure of the dry row. And so the Gemara then is going to be saying that in the case of 3 out of 6, and one side is going to be outside of the 6, it's going to refer to this 6 tefach dry row that's created by sandwiching in these 3 irrigated tefachim. And basically, the idea is that it's going to be saying that, where you have this first grouping, it's going to consist only of 2 tefachim of dry land out of the 6, and it's not going to be, it's not going to basically be significant enough to be saved. And so because of that, you're going to have to plant everything of the same species. So the Gemara is going to say, the Gemara is going to move on to the next topic and talk about the Mishnah, because the Mishnah was teaching that a fence or a ditch is going to constitute a separation between fields of different species. And that's very intuitive, right? So the Gemara now is going to talk about a related case where somebody's going to try to put a crop in a field and another crop on top of a fence. So you have some sort of, let's say you have a stone wall, and you're trying to put some dirt on the stone wall, and you're going to plant something on top of the stone wall. And then you have crops on one side and crops on another side. So the Gemara is going to continue. It's going to say, with regard to the law of Kilayim, a crop sown on top of a fence is like one sowed in the elevated field. So this is going to be a fence topped with earth, and then you're planting seeds on it to grow. And the Gemara is going to talk about a brisa. It says concerning 2 neighboring fields planted with different species, and one of which is 10 tefachim higher than the other. This is the law, that the upper field is regarded as being alongside a ditch 10 tefachim deep. So we covered this in Masechet Peah, where let's say you have, when you go around the Jerusalem hills, you'll see some very hilly area, and you'll see some terracing. It's been around for a long time, and you see in the terracing, you'll see like olive trees, and then you'll see a next terrace down along this steep hill, and then you'll see another set of olive trees. Well, the same could be done for grain. And if you have it where you have this edge of a hill that's terraced, and it's going to be like at least 10 tefachim high, it's going to be considered 2 different fields. And by the way, for Peah, it's going to be counted for 2 different sets of Peah. So the Gemara says, and the lower field is regarded as being alongside a fence 10 tefachim higher. And therefore, basically, the plantings of the 2 fields are not going to be considered Kilayim. And the same would apply where one species is sown on top of a fence, and next to it, you're going to have an adjoining field. It's not going to be considered Kilayim. So in the case of the 2 fields, there's going to be a 10 tefach height difference between the 2. And basically, that's going to make it like 2 different fields. If you have less than that, it's not going to count as 2 different fields. And Rabbi Kanievsky says about this that, the plantings are going to be permitted, and the same case is going to apply in the case where you have a fence where you have crops that grow on the fence, and the plants on top of the fence are going to be separated from those below by a ditch. In other words, it's going to be the case where this is going to count like a separate field. Why? Because the plants are elevated 10 tefachim higher than the field below it, and it's going to count as being its own field. Now, the Gemara is going to look at this ruling regarding crops planted on top of a fence, and they say in the Academy of Yadai, a fence, one is permitted to plant on top of it, and any species one desires, even if the adjoining field contains a different species. Again, this is going to be within context of this law. This fence has to be 10 tefachim high. And again, why is that working? Because it's regarded as its own field, and it's going to be elevated 10 tefachim higher than the field below it on either side. It's going to be a strip. In other words, the Chachamim are playing with this to try to teach you how to go and look at a set piece of land, like if you're going around Jerusalem, where it's very, very hilly, and you do have terracing, so that you can see, oh, this is a field that's a field, this is not Kilayim, and you'll have the tool set to understand it. So we get back into the fence of 10 tefachim, and it's going to constitute this separation between fields, and the Gemara wants to get more into this man-made fence separating the fields. And it says in the law of a fence, there is sometimes a leniency and sometimes a stringency. The Gemara is going to explain this. It's going to say, how does this come about, that you can have a fence that can produce both a leniency and a stringency? And the Gemara says, if there's an area of less than a bet rova cleared in the middle of a grain field, it is forbidden to sow a foreign species there. So we know that the Mishnah before is going to rule that if you have different species of grains or grain and vegetables, it has to be separated by a tract of unplanted land. It has to measure at least a bet rova. And in this case, since you have a clearing that's going to be less than the bet rova, by the way, is 1/24th or about 4.16% of a field, this separation between the species is impossible because it is smaller than that. And therefore, it's forbidden to plant a foreign species anywhere in this clearing. Again, you have where if you have just under the 4%, you can get these nullification things in order to start playing with these rules. And basically, you're not going to be able to go ahead and plant this. So the idea is going to be that if you surround the cleared area with a fence now, it's permitted to sow a foreign species there. The idea is that you've created a fence that now runs along the boundary between this little cleared area and the grain field. It's now going to separate two species, and they're not going to be deemed to be Kilayim. Why? Because you're complying with the law in Vayikra 19:19, where you're not sowing two species into one area. You've created this visually distinctive thing. That's going to be a fence. And in this case, you have a fence that creates a leniency, because before you wouldn't be allowed to do it. And now that you've created a fence in this little gap and put something new inside of this gap, you can go ahead and plant it, whereas before you couldn't because of the fence. Then it says, if there's a bet rove of unplanted land in an unplanted area, it is permitted to sow two species there as long as one leaves a bet rova of empty space between the two. However, if one surrounds the area with a fence, it's forbidden to sow the two species there. And this is going to be a case where now the presence of a fence is going to create a stringency. If you have two species and they're now going to be surrounded by a fence, this fence is going to bring the two together. And it's going to cause it, says Rabbi Kanievsky, to be regarded as a single planting. And therefore, even if it's now separated by a bet rova, it's going to be Kilayim with each other because it's going to be a single planting, and you've now surrounded this single planting of two things within a fence. So that's going to create a stringency. Now, the Gemara is going to talk about, plants in a dry patch, and we talked about on top of a fence, and it's not going to be Kilayim with those fields, and it's going to now question that. And it's going to say, in the case of a fence whose top is seeded and covered with plants, what is the law regarding whether it saves plants in the field on the other side from the Kilayim designation? And similarly, in the case of a dry patch of land that's seeded and covered with plants, what is the law regarding whether it saves the vegetables in the field on the other side from a Kilayim designation? In other words, the question is going to be, do the plants growing on the fence or in the dry patch prevent them from interposing between different species, or is this not going to be a concern? And I want to point out something from the Marafulda about this, that the Gemara is speaking of Zerayim, which is going to talk about all sorts of crops from grain to kitniot to vegetables. And basically, when we're looking at a dry row, it's going to speak about vegetables. And this is going to be because whereas a fence is effective in separating any crop, a dry row is only effective with vegetables. And that's going to be what this is probing at. So the same question is also going to be with a dry row, although an unplanted dry row certainly is going to act to separate between different species of vegetables. And although vegetables planted on a dry row do not themselves become Kilayim with the vegetables in the adjoining rows, assuming that you follow this 3 out of 6 tefachim criteria, it may be that the planted row does not separate between vegetables growing on either side, and therefore it does become kilayim with each other. And the reasoning is that because there are crops growing in the dry row, the row appears to be part of the kilayim mixture and not as a separator. So again, we're talking about vegetables for the dry row, but what about if you're doing something else? So the Gemara is going to try to resolve that, because again, if you're planting like kidney oat there, well, maybe the dry row is not going to be significant enough. So Rabbi Shmuel, in the name of Rabbi Zera, learned the answer from this following brisa. It says, and one may plant 2 different species next to the roots of a tree that dried out, one on each side of the roots, for the roots serve as a separation between the 2 species. And the brisa states only that have dried out, which is implying that, says the Gemara, moist live roots are prohibited. In other words, the tree that's going to be live is going to be where it's going to preclude the use of being a partition to separate between fields. And basically it's going to be like you have a fence, right? This tree is basically going to be like a fence, and the roots are going to be like a fence, provided that it has enough roots to create a visually distinctive separating space. But again, this is not going to be where we're talking about a live tree. So this is a case where the roots are going to form a wall, and this is going to occur when they're going to serve to separate between different species, and it's going to be significant enough to prevent them from becoming kilayim. So the Gemara now is going to talk about another proof from the Mishnah, and again, it's going to bring this list of other things that can serve as a separator. So Rabbi Yosei learned the opposite from this teaching in the Mishnah, that one may plant diverse species alongside uncultivated land, plowed land, an unmortared stone wall, a road, a fence that is 10 tefachim high, and a tree that covers the ground with branches. By the way, along the idea of the unmortared stone wall, you'd say, but what about a stone wall? Well, that would just be a fence, right? But we're talking about a loosely built collection of stones that now is going to create this separator that has to at least be 10 tefachim high. Is that going to count? So that's going to be the lenient thing. We know what the mortared wall is. Well, that's just a fence. And we know that if a fence is going to be 10 tefachim high, that's going to separate between this and that. But what about the tree that covers the ground with branches? And the Gemara continues, says, this, in other words, the law of the tree, tells us that a fence that was seeded and likewise a dry patch that was seeded saves the plants on the other side from a kilayim designation. So in other words, if a tree is considered a separate entity to separate the, to really show a visually distinctive thing, to separate the growth, and it should be the same for a dry patch and fence, even where crops are going to be growing. But the Gemara is going to reject that proof. And it says that you may say, even despite our Mishnah, that a fence that was seeded does not save plants on either side from a kilayim designation. And in other words, the Mishnah is ruling that a tree is going to constitute a valid separation between species, is going to demonstrate nothing with regard to the main question. And the idea here is going to be, what about if we're talking about, fields being seen as single entities? That's the question. So the Gemara says it is different here than in the case of the tree. For this is a fence that was sown with seed, and one could argue that a fence that was itself sown with seed cannot save fields that are sown with seed. For the similarity of their plantings cause the fence and the fields to be viewed as a single entity. So the idea is that if you're having it where you're having vegetables, that's going to be one thing. If you have vegetables here, you have vegetables on top of the fence, you have vegetables over on the other side of the fence, that's going to be seen as different entities. But if you're planting everything with barley on one side of the fence, you have a strip of wheat on top of the fence, and then a strip of wheat on the other side of the fence, is that really going to be viewed as 3 different entities? Is that really going to be viewed as 3 different fields? And, in this case about the foliage of the tree, it's going to be different in appearance from that of the field it separates, because you're going to have leaves that are going to be there, and the tree is going to be deemed to be a valid separation. In other words, although the foliage of a tree is different in appearance from the growth found in the field of grain or even vegetables, the vegetation that appears on the roots do bear some similarity to that of the field. And it's for this reason that it's going to say that the law of the tree roots is going to be like a fence top of the vegetation that cannot serve to separate between these two things. So that's a surprising Gemara. And the Gemara is going to really kind of like ask a follow-up question. And Rabbi Yudan inquires and says, dry land and irrigated land, what is the law with regard to whether they combine? And that's a good question. So the Gemara is going to explain. It's going to say, what is the case? And it follows. It says that there was an unplanted area, and between a row of vegetables and a field of grain. And that measures 10 1/2 amos long, and you have this 6 tefachim wide area, which does not require dry land. But one made it with a strip of dry land on one side. And the Gemara now is basically saying that you have a 6 tefach area, okay, and you now have a row of vegetables. Let's say the row of vegetables is in the middle, and you have a 6 tefachim separation. Now you have on the other side area a 6 tefachim area, and that's going to be dry land. Is that going to serve as a separation? Before, we saw in the case of the dry land, well, that would be a separator between different rows of vegetables. So even in the case now, it's asking another follow-up. It says, well, let's say we talk about our 6 tefachim separator now, and we have only 3 tefach is going to be dry land, and it's going to be next to some vegetables, and we have 3 tefach of irrigated land, and then we have a grain field. Well, in the cases that we were talking about before, we were talking about cases of vegetables next to vegetables. Now we have vegetables next to grain. The other question is, well, if you're going to be taking this law of dry land, well, what if you don't quite have 6 tefachim of dry land? Can you use a little bit of the irrigated land to count now as a 6 tefach strip? Will they combine? That's what it's asking. So the Gemara is basically going to leave this unresolved. In other words, the question is, Gemara says, what is the law with regard to planting different species of grain and vegetables next to 2 sides of the separating area? In other words, does the dry area combine with the irrigated area? And is that going to be this 6 tefachim separator? Or does the separation have to be only of one type of land? Like all of it has to be dry land? That question is unresolved. So the Mishnah now is going to get onto the next set of things to separate. It's going to talk about a boulder. Giant rocks are all over the place in the Jerusalem hills. And let's say you have a 10 tefach high boulder. It's going to be 4 tefachim wide. That, by the way, is going to be a valid separation between different diverse species. And as we learned in Masechet Peah, that would be enough to separate between field 1 and field 2. In that case, you would have to leave 2 different payas. And so over here, because it would be like 2 different fields, well, if you plant it on one side of a boulder that's going to be 10 tefachim high and pretty big, it's going to be at least 4 tefachim wide, and it's going to be 10 tefachim long, well, that's going to be significant enough where it's going to create a separator. The Gemara says that they taught in a brisa, Rabbi Yonatan ben Yosei says, if there was a boulder that was 10 tefachim long and 4 tefachim wide, but it's less than 10 tefachim high, it is permitted to plant different species next to its sides. In other words, those separated by the length of the rock. Now, by the way, if it's going to be 10 tefachim wide and 10 tefachim high and 4 tefachim wide and 10 tefachim long, so it's going to be 10 by 10 by 4, well, then there's not going to be a problem. This is now talking about where the boulder is less than 10 tefachim. So, maybe it's going to be 6 tefachim. And then you have 10 tefachim long, it's 4 tefachim wide. What's going to be the case? So the Gemara is basically going to be saying that normally a boulder has to be 10 tefachim high. But this is trying to say that if you have a horizontal measure of 10 tefachim, it can take the place of the vertical measure. Accordingly, a low rock measuring 10 tefachim long and 4 across is going to serve to separate between species planted at the far ends. In other words, so the case is going to go like this, right? You have a boulder. It's not 10 tefachim high. Okay? If it was 10 tefachim high, it would be no problem. But it isn't. It's 6. Let's say it's 6. So now you have a 4 tefachim wide boulder, and it's 10 tefachim long. So you have 4 sides alongside of the boulder, right? So if you want to plant on the area that's going to be the northmost part of the boulder, that's going to be 4 tefachim wide, and it's separated now by the southernmost area of the boulder, and it's going to be separated by 10 tefachim. Yes, even though it's less than 10 tefachim, it's separated by 10 tefachim, you're allowed to plant between the northernmost area and the southernmost area. But if you want to plant on the leftmost area of the boulder and the rightmost area of the boulder, what's going to be the problem? Well, the problem is it's only separated by 4 tefachim. It's not far enough to distinguish between this planting and that planting. In other words, it's not significant enough separation to plant it as 2 different fields. So that's going to be, continuing on in this Gemara, it's going to say that it is permitted to plant different species next to the two sides. That's going to be on the length of the rock. However, if the boulder was 10 tefachim square, it is permitted to plant different species next to all 4 sides. In other words, if it's going to be 10 tefachim long or high, now you can plant on all 4 sides of the boulder, no problem. And, the side of, the 4 tefachim area connecting to the 10 tefachim long area, that's going to be like a rosh tor. And it's going to be enough to create a separator between all of these because it's alongside a boulder that's 10 tefachim high, 10 tefachim wide, and 4 tefachim wide. But in the case where it's not going to be 10 tefachim high, you can only plant 2 out of 4 areas, not 4 out of 4 areas. And in the case where this is going to be 4 by 10 by 10, 10 tefachim high, then you're going to be able to plant all 4 areas. And that is going to finish up with this. Now, why do we care about this? Well, this is helping us to learn how to organize fields and to go by and visually see, if we're a farmer, how, do we have, 1 set of paya? Do we have 2 sets of paya? Do we have 2 different areas that we can plant and it's not going to be intermingled and there's not going to be a problem with it? So it's trying to teach us with these sorts of puzzles how to identify fields. Have a great day.